Okay, so now we are going to discuss the global approach. So I'm going to go to my save one method in person service simple, and I'm just going to simulate a null pointer exception as we have done so far. I'm going to restart my application and go to my save one people, and here I put null, and you can see because I haven't configured any exception handling, I have the general 500 internal server error and this general message. Now I can go to my person controller and I can use this exception handler, and the value which I can put, I will put exception.class. So whenever a general exception is thrown, this method will be fired. So I'm going to go to my package and I'm going to create a class global exception, and here I'm just going to put like a exception message, then let us put a status code and a general message which we can show to the front end. And then I'm going to create a constructor, and here I'm going to put an exception object, and this exception message is exception get message, and this status code, let's just put HTTP internal server error because it's a general exception handling. General message I can put, please something wrong with the server, please contact support gmail.com, let's say like this. Let me put a getter and setter. Okay, and now I can have a public response entity, global exception, handle global exception. And here I'm going to put my exception which will be thrown, return new response entity, new global exception E, and HTTP status internal server error, and restart this. So now instead of my custom exception which we have coded in the previous video when we talked about exception handler, I put this more general exception which can be thrown in our application. So now when I'm firing this, you will see my custom exception. Now this doesn't mean that now I have a global exception handling in my application. Now let me show you why. So here I'm going to create another controller, department controller, and I'm not going to add new endpoints, but I'm just going to add the res controller request mapping API, and I'm going to copy the same endpoint which we have here. Let me just copy this. I need to put the name of the constructor, and here I'm just going to copy the post mapping endpoint which throws our exception. Now I'm going to restart, and I'm going to have an error. I wanted explicitly to show you this error where it says ambiguous mapping. Why it's happening this? Because we have two post mapping controller, two request mapping controller with the same mapping. Here we have API peoples in department, and here we have API peoples. This happens because there is an ambiguous. There are duplicates, and it's trying to register the same mapping on two different methods. So I'm just going to put something like departments peoples. And again, this is not a new endpoint. It's just to show you that the way we have added now this exception handler, although we have the exception class, and it will execute this method whenever we have a null pointer, index, untold bound exception, and every exception which basically inherits this class. This doesn't mean we have global exception handling in our application. And now in my department controller, I'm just going to call this endpoint which basically will execute the same method and will throw the same exception. So let me just copy this. I can go here, and instead of peoples I can put departments peoples. I'm going to put post body raw JSON. Let me copy this, and you see I don't have my exception the way which have been configured here. Why is that? Because this add exception handler only works for this particular class. This doesn't work for all my controllers in my application. So that's why this is not a global approach. So I'm going to show you now the global approach. So I'm going to create here in my package a new class, global exception handler. And I'm going to copy this and I'm going to put this here. So to use a global approach in handling exception, Spring has this annotation called controller advice. Now what controller advice does behind the scenes? This controller advice will scan all your components annotated with REST controller and controller, and will register them. And if a particular method in your controller throws this exception, this method will be executed. So basically the behavior in which we want. So imagine that this method is being added to every controller in our application. So instead of having a duplicate code, something like this, now we have a duplicate code, the same code here and the same code here. We can just delete this and we can just delete this. And now we can restart the application. And now whenever an exception will be thrown, because of this annotation, Spring will map this for us. So now you see I have the same global exception handler here. Now if I delete this and restart, I won't have an exception handler. You see? So this is a So this is a global approach. Now you can go here, and this controller advice also inherits the add component. If you remember from our slides with components, I also added this one. So this is also a bin which is being registered, and we can also search this. So let me search global exception handler. Now let me restart the application. Global exception handler, and you see it's a bin also. So the Spring has registered this bin, and based on our configuration in a person controller and department controller, every time a new exception is thrown, which it isn't handled by the locally, it will be handled by this exception handler which we have configured here. So you see right now we have like a global approach where we can configure here all our global exception in our application. So it's a much more separation of concerns approach, because we have a particular class where we can handle our exception.